The rain had been falling for 3 hours when the call came through, and Lieutenant Sarah Collins felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always preceded something wrong. Not the routine kind of wrong that populated most shifts in Atlanta, but the deep and unsettling kind that left marks on the soul. She glanced at Max in the rearview mirror, his amber eyes already fixed on her. Ears perked forward as if he had heard the dispatcher's voice and understood every word. 7 years together had taught her to trust that look. Max knew things before she did, sensed the weight of moments before they fully materialized, and right now his body language screamed that tonight would be different. Auburn Avenue glistened under the amber glow of streetlights, the wet asphalt reflecting the colors of the city like a dark mirror. The intersection with Piedmont was usually quiet at this hour, but tonight a cluster of patrol cars had already formed a perimeter around something that Sarah could not yet see. She pulled the unmarked cruiser to the curb and killed the engine, feeling the rain immediately begin to drum against the windshield with renewed intensity. The dispatcher had said, "Abandoned vehicle, possible hazmat situation," but the number of units already on scene told a different story. Hazmat did not draw this kind of attention. This was something else. Sarah stepped out into the rain, pulling her collar up against the cold drops that immediately found the gap between her jacket and her neck. She opened the rear door, and Max bounded out, his paws splashing in the shallow puddles that had formed along the gutter. He shook once, sending droplets flying, then fell into position at her left side. His movements precise and controlled, despite the chaos of flashing lights and radio chatter that surrounded them. Together, they approached the perimeter, Sarah's badge already in hand, her eyes scanning the scene for the ranking officer. She found Sergeant Davis near the inner cordon, his face drawn and pale in a way that immediately set off alarm bells in her mind. Davis was a 20-year veteran who had seen everything Atlanta had to offer, from gang executions to domestic horrors that would haunt most people for life. The fact that he looked shaken told Sarah more than any briefing could have. "What do we have?" she asked, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of rain and radio static. Davis turned to face her, and for a moment he seemed to struggle with where to begin. "Taxicab," he finally said, "abandoned right in the middle of the intersection about 40 minutes ago. Engine was still running when first unit arrived. Driver's door was open, keys in the ignition, but no driver anywhere in sight. We ran the plates and got nothing unusual. Registered to Yellow Cab Atlanta, no outstanding warrants, no flags of any kind." Sarah waited, knowing there was more. Davis would not look like this over an abandoned taxi. The sergeant glanced toward the vehicle, a yellow Crown Victoria that sat beneath the traffic lights like a wounded animal, its doors hanging open and its interior light casting a weak glow into the rain. "We were about to have it towed when Officer Brennan noticed something in the trunk. It was not fully closed, just resting on the latch without engaging. He popped it open to check for anything that might explain the abandonment." "And?" Davis met her eyes, and Sarah saw something there that she rarely encountered in veteran officers. Fear, yes, but also confusion, as if what he had witnessed did not fit into any category his experience had prepared him for. "There is a man inside, Lieutenant, alive, bound and gagged, but alive, and he is holding something, a photograph. He will not let go of it, will not stop staring at it, and when we tried to take it from him, he started screaming through the gag. We backed off and called for you because of what the photograph shows." "What does it show?" Sarah asked, though some part of her already knew the answer, could feel it in the way Max had begun to shift his weight beside her, his attention locked on the taxi with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Davis took a breath. "It shows you, Lieutenant. The photograph is of you, taken yesterday. From the look of it, you are walking out of the precinct, heading to your car. The angle suggests a long lens, maybe from across the street or from one of the parking structures. Someone has been watching you, and whoever put that man in the trunk wanted you to know it. The words landed like physical blows, each one driving home a reality that Sarah had never anticipated. She had made enemies over the years. That was inevitable in her line of work, but this was different. This was calculated, theatrical, designed to send a message that went beyond simple intimidation. Whoever had done this wanted her attention, wanted her engaged, wanted her to understand that she was not the hunter in this scenario. She moved toward the taxi without another word, Max keeping pace beside her. The rain intensified as she approached, as if the sky itself was trying to wash away whatever horror awaited her in that trunk. She could see the officers who had formed a loose circle around the vehicle, their faces illuminated by the strobing lights of their cruisers, each one wearing an expression of barely contained unease. They parted for her without being asked, recognizing her rank and her reputation, knowing that if anyone could make sense of this situation, it would be the lieutenant who had built her career on cases that others considered unsolvable. The trunk was open perhaps 6 inches, just enough to see the darkness within without revealing its contents. Sarah stopped 3 feet away and looked down at Max, who had frozen in place. His body had gone rigid, every muscle tense, his eyes fixed on the trunk with an intensity she had only seen a handful of times in their years together. He was not indicating drugs or explosives, the 2 things he had been primarily trained to detect. This was something else, something that triggered a deeper instinct, a primal recognition of wrongness that transcended his formal training. "Easy," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Let us see what we are dealing with." She stepped forward and lifted the trunk lid, the hinges groaning in protest, as the metal swung upward to reveal what lay within. The interior light flickered once, twice, then stabilized, casting its pale illumination over a scene that would remain burned into Sarah's memory for the rest of her life. The man was curled into a fetal position, his wrists bound behind his back with what appeared to be professional-grade zip ties, his ankles secured in the same manner. A strip of silver duct tape covered his mouth, but his eyes were wide open, staring up at her with an expression that combined terror, relief, and something else that she could not immediately identify. He was perhaps 50 years old, with thinning grey hair and the soft physique of someone who spent their days behind a desk. His clothes were expensive but disheveled, a suit that had probably cost several $1,000s now wrinkled and stained from his confinement, and clutched in his bound hands, held against his chest like a talisman, was a photograph. Even from her angle, Sarah could see that Davis had not exaggerated. The image showed her walking across the precinct parking lot, her badge visible on her belt, Max trotting beside her. The shot was crisp and clear, taken with professional equipment by someone who knew what they were doing. The timestamp in the corner confirmed what Davis had suspected. The photograph had been taken less than 24 hours ago. Sarah leaned closer, forcing herself to maintain eye contact with the man in the trunk. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline that was now flooding her system. "My name is Lieutenant Sarah Collins. I am with the Atlanta Police Department. You are safe now. We are going to get you out of there and get you medical attention. Do you understand?" The man's eyes widened further at the sound of her name, and he began to nod frantically, his bound hands tightening on the photograph. Tears began to stream down his face, mixing with the rain that was now falling directly into the open trunk. "I'm going to remove the tape from your mouth," Sarah continued. "I need you to stay calm and tell me what happened. Can you do that?" Another frantic nod. Sarah reached in and carefully peeled the duct tape away, wincing internally at the red marks it left on the man's skin. The moment his mouth was free, he drew a ragged breath, then another, his chest heaving as he fought to fill his lungs with air that was not recycled through a layer of adhesive. "He said you would come," the man gasped, his voice raw and cracked from disuse. "He said if he left me here, you would be the one to find me." He knows everything about you, everything. He told me things, details about your life, your schedule, your routines. He has been watching you for months, maybe longer. Who? Sarah demanded, leaning closer. Who did this to you? Did you see his face? The man shook his head, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. Never. He always wore a mask, kept the lights low, spoke in a whisper. But he talked about you constantly, like you were the most important person in the world. He called himself the driver, said he had been waiting for the right moment to introduce himself, and that I was just the invitation. Sarah felt Max press against her leg, a subtle gesture of support that grounded her in the moment. She reached into the trunk and began working on the zip ties that bound the man's wrists, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency despite the tremor that threatened to undermine her control. "What is your name?" she asked, needing to establish basic facts, to anchor this nightmare in something concrete and procedural. "Ronald." The man managed. "Ronald Meeks. I am an accountant. I work downtown in the financial district. I was walking to my car 3 nights ago, late after finishing some quarterly reports. And then nothing. I woke up in a dark room, tied to a chair, and he was there, the driver. He said I had been chosen for a very important purpose." The zip ties fell away, and Ronald Meeks immediately clutched the photograph tighter, as if it were the only thing keeping him connected to reality. Sarah helped him sit up, then assisted as 2 paramedics who had been waiting nearby moved in to transfer him to a stretcher. Throughout the process, Meeks never let go of the photograph, and his eyes never left Sarah's face. "He wanted me to give you a message," Meeks said, as the paramedics began to wheel him toward the waiting ambulance. "He said the game has begun, and that you should pay attention to the taxis. He said there have been others, and there will be more, unless you can find him first. He said you are the only one who can end this." Sarah watched the ambulance doors close, watched the vehicle pull away with lights flashing but no siren, and felt the weight of those words settle onto her shoulders like a physical burden. The rain continued to fall, washing away the evidence of what had transpired, turning the crime scene into a maze of puddles and reflections. Around her, officers moved with purpose, securing the taxi, photographing every inch of the scene. But Sarah remained motionless, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just learned. Max pressed against her leg again, and this time she looked down to meet his amber gaze. His ears were still forward, his body still tense. But there was something else in his expression now, something that looked almost like determination. He understood, in whatever way a dog could understand such things, that they had just been drawn into something that went beyond their normal operations. This was not a case they could hand off to another unit, not a problem that would resolve itself through standard procedure. This was personal, Collins. She turned to find Captain Morrison approaching, his umbrella doing little to shield him from the rain that was now coming down at an angle. He was a broad man with a face that rarely showed emotion, but tonight Sarah could see the concern that creased his features. "I just got briefed," he said, stopping beside her and following her gaze to the taxi that was now being loaded onto a flatbed tow truck. "This is going to require a special approach. I'm assigning you lead on the investigation, full resources, whatever you need." But Sarah and his use of her first name underscored the gravity of what he was about to say. "If this escalates, if you feel compromised in any way, I need you to tell me. We cannot have you running an investigation where you are both the detective and the target." "I understand," Sarah replied, though she had no intention of stepping back. Whoever this driver was, he had made a mistake by making this personal. He had given her a reason to hunt him with every resource at her disposal, and she would not stop until she found him. Good. Morrison nodded once, then turned to leave. "Keep me updated. And Collins, be careful. Whoever this is, he has demonstrated significant planning capability. Do not underestimate him." Sarah watched her captain walk away, then looked down at Max one more time. "Come on," she said quietly. We have work to do." The precinct was humming with activity when Sarah arrived an hour later, the news of the abandoned taxi having spread through the department with the speed of wildfire. Officers she barely knew stopped her in the hallways to offer support, to ask if she was okay, to volunteer their assistance in whatever capacity she might need. She accepted their concern with brief nods and shorter words, her mind already focused on the task ahead. Sympathy would not catch the driver. Only evidence would do that. She commandeered a conference room on the third floor and began assembling everything they had. The taxi itself was being processed by forensics, every surface dusted for prints, every fiber collected for analysis. Ronald Meeks was at Grady Memorial Hospital, under observation for dehydration and psychological trauma, but stable enough to provide a more detailed statement in the morning. The photograph had been logged into evidence, and Sarah had requested a full analysis of the image data, hoping that some metadata might reveal where and how it had been taken. Max lay in the corner of the conference room, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained open and alert. He watched Sarah move around the room, pinning documents to a corkboard, drawing connections on a whiteboard, building the skeleton of an investigation that would consume her for the foreseeable future. He was patient, as he always was, trusting her to do what needed to be done, while he stood ready to assist in whatever way his abilities allowed. The first breakthrough came just before dawn, when a bleary-eyed analyst named Chen knocked on the conference room door and entered without waiting for a response. "Lieutenant," he said, holding up a tablet, "I think I found something. You asked me to check for similar incidents, abandoned taxis with unusual circumstances. I went back 6 months and found 4 cases that match the pattern." Sarah set down the file she had been reading and crossed to where Chen stood. "Show me." He handed her the tablet, which displayed a map of Atlanta with 4 markers scattered across different neighborhoods. Each marker was accompanied by a date and a brief description. "January 15th, Chen began. A taxi was found abandoned in Midtown, with the engine running and the driver's door open. No driver, no signs of struggle, but when they searched the vehicle, they found a single white glove tucked under the passenger seat. February 3rd, another taxi, this time in Buckhead. Same scenario, engine running, no driver. This time they found a wristwatch, expensive, stopped at exactly midnight, March 22nd, West End. Taxi abandoned near a bus stop. Inside they found a wedding ring. No inscription, no way to trace it. April 9th, East Atlanta. Taxi left in a grocery store parking lot. They found a set of house keys in the glove compartment that did not match any known address. Sarah studied the map, her mind working to find the pattern that connected these seemingly random incidents. Were the drivers ever found? Chen shook his head. That is the disturbing part. All 4 drivers vanished without a trace. No bodies have been recovered, no ransom demands have been received, no communication of any kind. They just disappeared. And until tonight, no one connected the cases because they happened in different precincts, and no one was looking for a pattern. "Until tonight," Sarah repeated, her voice grim. "Until he wanted us to see the pattern." She zoomed out on the map, taking in the full scope of the city, and began to see something that the individual markers had obscured. The locations were not random. They formed a rough arc across the northern half of Atlanta, starting in the west and curving toward the east. If she extended the pattern, predicted where the next point might fall, she found herself looking at an area that included her own precinct, her own neighborhood, the routes she traveled every day. "He has been building to this," she murmured. "Those drivers, whatever happened to them, they were practice, they were preparation. This whole time he has been working toward me, and he wanted me to find this pattern only when he was ready." Chen shifted uncomfortably. "Lieutenant, should we be worried about your safety? If this individual has been planning something like this for 6 months or longer, we might need to consider protective measures." Sarah handed the tablet back to him. "What we need," she said firmly, "is to find this guy before he can make his next move. I want full files on all 4 missing drivers. I want to know everything about them, where they lived, who they knew, what routes they drove. There has to be a connection, something that made them targets. Find it." Chen nodded and hurried out of the room, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and her dog. She walked to the window and looked out at the city, which was just beginning to emerge from the darkness of night. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, still glistening with the remnants of the storm. Somewhere out there, the driver was watching, waiting, planning his next move. He had spent months preparing for this moment, and Sarah knew that whatever game he was playing, it was only just beginning. She felt Max's presence beside her before she heard him move, his warm body pressing against her leg in that familiar gesture of solidarity. She reached down and ran her fingers through the fur on his neck, feeling the tension in his muscles, the coiled energy that was always there just beneath the surface. "We are going to find him," she said quietly. "I do not know how yet, but we are going to find him and we are going to stop him." Max looked up at her, and in his amber eyes she saw a reflection of her own determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as they had faced everything else in their years of partnership. That was the one thing the driver had not counted on, the one variable he could not have predicted. The bond between a handler and her K-9, a connection that transcended training and procedure to become something almost supernatural in its intensity. The morning brought new developments, not all of them welcome. Ronald Meeks was awake and talking, but his statement provided little new information. He confirmed that he had been held in a dark room for approximately 72 hours. Fed twice daily, given water at regular intervals, but subjected to constant psychological manipulation. The driver had spoken to him often, always in that same hoarse whisper, always about Sarah Collins. He had described her schedule in detail, her habits, her relationships, her history with the department. He had shown Meeks photographs, dozens of them, documenting Sarah's movements over what appeared to be several months. And he had made it clear that Meeks was merely a messenger, a means of initiating contact, the first move in a game that the driver fully intended to win. The forensic analysis of the taxi proved equally frustrating. The vehicle had been wiped clean of prints, vacuumed to remove any trace evidence, processed with a level of care that suggested professional knowledge of crime scene analysis. The only item of interest was the photograph itself, which had been printed on standard photo paper available at any drugstore, using a printer that could have been purchased anywhere. The metadata from the original image had been scrubbed, leaving no digital trail to follow. Sarah spent the morning reviewing the files on the 4 missing taxi drivers, looking for any connection that might explain why they had been chosen. What she found was both disappointing and disturbing. The drivers had nothing obvious in common. Different ages, different backgrounds, different areas of the city where they operated. One was a recent immigrant from Ethiopia, another a lifelong Atlanta native. One had a family with 3 children, another was a bachelor with no close relatives. They drove for different companies, lived in different neighborhoods, had no shared acquaintances that anyone could identify. The only common thread, Sarah realized as she stared at the photographs of the 4 missing men, was their profession. They were all taxi drivers, all part of the invisible workforce that moved through the city every day, carrying passengers from one destination to another, privy to countless conversations and secrets, but rarely noticed or remembered. The driver had chosen his victims from among his own kind, selecting men whose disappearance would raise minimal alarm, whose absence would be attributed to the transient nature of their work. She was still processing this realization when Detective Martinez knocked on the conference room door. "Lieutenant," he said, "we might have something. One of the missing drivers, the one from February. His wife has been trying to reach someone in the department for months. She claims her husband mentioned something strange in the days before he disappeared. Something about a fare that gave him the creeps. No one followed up because the case was assigned to missing persons, and they decided he probably just walked away from his debts. Sarah was on her feet before Martinez finished speaking. "Get me her address. I want to talk to her now." The wife's name was Esperanza Delgado, and she lived in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city. She was a small woman with dark hair and tired eyes, the kind of eyes that came from months of waiting for news that never arrived. She welcomed Sarah and Max into her home with a mixture of hope and suspicion, clearly uncertain whether this sudden interest in her husband's case was a good sign or a bad one. "Mrs. Delgado," Sarah began once they were seated in the cramped living room, "I understand your husband mentioned something unusual before he disappeared. Can you tell me about that?" Esperanza nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "Miguel was not the type to get spooked," she said. "He had been driving a cab for 15 years, and he had seen everything. Robberies, fights, people trying to run without paying. Nothing fazed him. But about a week before he vanished, he came home one night, and he was different. Quiet, nervous. He kept checking the locks, looking out the windows like he expected someone to be there." "Did he tell you what happened?" "Not at first. He said it was nothing, just a weird fare, but I could tell it was more than that. Finally, the night before he disappeared, he told me. He said he had picked up a man in Midtown, normal-looking guy, nothing special, but the whole ride the man just sat in the back seat and stared at him. Did not say where he wanted to go, did not answer any questions, just stared. Miguel finally pulled over and told him to get out, and the man did. But before he closed the door, he leaned back in and said something that made Miguel's blood run cold." "What did he say?" Esperanza's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He said, 'I know where you live. I know where your wife works. I know what route your children take to school. And soon, everyone will know who I am.' Then he smiled and walked away, and Miguel never saw him again. The next night, Miguel went to work, and he never came home." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the apartment. This was the driver, she was certain of it. 6 months ago, maybe longer, he had already been planning, already been watching, already been selecting his victims with the cold precision of a predator studying a herd. "Mrs. Delgado, did your husband describe this man? Any details at all about his appearance?" Esperanza shook her head. "He said the man was average. Average height, average build, average clothes. Nothing that stood out." The only thing Miguel mentioned was his voice. He said it was strange, like a whisper, like the man was trying to disguise how he really sounded. Sarah thanked Esperanza for her time and promised that she would do everything in her power to find out what had happened to Miguel. It was a promise she intended to keep, not just for Esperanza, but for all the families of the missing drivers, for Ronald Meeks, who would carry the trauma of his abduction for the rest of his life, and for herself, because the driver had made this personal, and she would not rest until she had looked into his eyes and made him answer for what he had done. Back at the precinct, Sarah convened a meeting of the task force that Captain Morrison had authorized her to assemble. Around the table sat detectives from Homicide, Missing Persons, and the Special Victims Unit, along with analysts from the Intelligence Division and a liaison from the FBI's Atlanta field office. Sarah had resisted the federal involvement initially, but Morrison had insisted, and she had to admit that the additional resources might prove useful. She laid out everything they had, the abandoned taxis, the missing drivers, the items left behind like trophies, and the message delivered through Ronald Meeks. She showed them the map with its ominous arc of locations and explained her theory that the driver had been building toward her specifically, using the other victims as practice, or preparation. The FBI liaison, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Reeves, was the first to speak. This level of planning suggests someone with significant resources and patience. 6 months of surveillance, multiple abductions, clean crime scenes. We are not dealing with an opportunistic predator. This is someone who has made hunting people his full-time occupation. Agreed, Sarah replied, which raises the question of motive. Why me? I have put away hundreds of criminals over the years, but this level of obsession suggests something more personal. He is not just trying to hurt me or scare me. He wants to engage me, to draw me into some kind of game. Have you reviewed your old cases? Detective Martinez asked. Anyone who might hold a grudge strong enough to spend 6 months planning something like this? Sarah nodded. I have been going through them since last night. The problem is the volume. In 15 years on the force, I have made a lot of enemies. Drug dealers, gang members, domestic abusers, white-collar criminals. Any of them could potentially harbor this kind of resentment, but none of them stand out as more likely than the others. What about the taxi connection? One of the analysts asked. You said the items left behind seemed like trophies. A glove, a watch, a ring, keys. Do those items mean anything to you personally? Sarah had been wondering the same thing. She had spent hours trying to find a pattern, some personal significance that would explain the choice of objects, but nothing had emerged. The watch was not a brand she recognized. The ring was generic. The keys opened no lock she knew of. Either the items had meaning only to the driver, or they were deliberately chosen to be meaningless, red herrings designed to send the investigation in the wrong direction. The meeting continued for another hour, with assignments distributed and timelines established. Detectives would re-interview the families of all missing drivers. Analysts would scrub traffic camera footage from the locations where the taxis had been found. The FBI would run the driver's profile through their database of known offenders, looking for matches in methodology or behavior. And Sarah would continue to serve as the focal point of the investigation, the bait that the driver had chosen, and the hunter who would ultimately bring him down. That night, Sarah took Max to the location where the first taxi had been found, the one from January with the white glove. The scene had long since been cleared, the street returned to its normal flow of traffic and pedestrians, but she wanted to see it for herself, to stand where the driver had stood and try to understand his thinking. The spot was unremarkable, a stretch of sidewalk in Midtown, near a cluster of restaurants and bars that catered to the after-work crowd. Sarah walked the perimeter while Max investigated the various scents that lingered on the concrete, his nose working overtime to process information that was invisible to human senses. Why here? Sarah murmured, more to herself than to her partner. What made this spot special? She looked around, trying to see the location through the driver's eyes. There were security cameras on several buildings nearby, but they were angled to cover the entrances, not the street. A traffic camera at the intersection might have captured something, but the footage had already been checked and showed nothing useful. The driver had chosen this spot because it was visible but not monitored, public but not observed. He understood how surveillance worked and had planned accordingly. Max suddenly stiffened, his attention fixed on something across the street. Sarah followed his gaze and saw a parking structure, its concrete facade, rising 6 stories above the neighboring buildings. She had noted it earlier, but dismissed it as irrelevant. Now, seeing it through Max's reaction, she realized its significance. That is where he watched from, she said. High ground, clear sightlines, easy access and egress. He could see everything that happened on this street without being seen himself. She crossed to the structure and entered through the pedestrian entrance, Max at her side. The interior was dim and smelled of exhaust fumes and old concrete, the kind of place where shadows pooled in corners and sounds echoed unpredictably. Sarah climbed the stairs to the top level, her hand resting on her weapon, her senses alert for any sign that she was not alone. The roof of the structure offered a panoramic view of the surrounding area, including the exact spot where the first taxi had been found. Sarah stood at the edge and looked down, imagining the driver in this same position, watching as his plan unfolded, savoring the confusion and fear that his actions had created. He had stood here, she was certain of it. This was his vantage point, his control center, the place where he had directed his operation like a general commanding troops in battle. Max began to sniff along the concrete barrier that ringed the roof. His nose pressed to the surface as he worked to isolate a particular scent from the multitude that had accumulated over time. Sarah watched him work, trusting his abilities, knowing that if there was anything to find, he would find it. After several minutes, Max stopped at a particular spot and sat down, his signal that he had located something of interest. Sarah approached and crouched beside him, examining the area he had indicated. At first, she saw nothing, just grey concrete stained with years of weather and neglect. But then, as she shifted her angle, she caught a glimpse of something scratched into the surface, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Letters. 2 of them carved into the concrete with what must have been a sharp tool. SC, her initials. Sarah felt a cold wave wash over her as the implications sank in. The driver had been here, had stood in this exact spot, and had left a message specifically for her to find. He had known, even months ago, that she would eventually come here, that her investigation would lead her to retrace his steps. He was not just one move ahead of her. He was playing an entirely different game, one where every piece had been positioned long before the opening move. She photographed the initials with her phone and marked the location for the forensic team, but she already knew what they would find. Nothing. The driver was too careful, too methodical, too aware of how investigations worked. He had left the initials because he wanted her to find them, wanted her to know that he had anticipated her actions, wanted her to understand that she was dancing to a tune he had composed. The next several days blurred together in a haze of interviews, evidence analysis, and dead ends. The task force worked around the clock, chasing leads that evaporated upon examination, building theories that collapsed under scrutiny. The FBI profile suggested a white male between 30 and 50, above average intelligence, likely with a background in law enforcement or security. The profile could have described thousands of men in the Atlanta metropolitan area. Sarah barely slept, catching brief naps on the couch in her office when exhaustion finally overwhelmed her. Max stayed by her side constantly, a silent guardian who seemed to understand that his presence was the only thing keeping her grounded. She talked to him during the quiet hours, laying out her thoughts and theories, using him as a sounding board even though he could not respond. The act of verbalizing her ideas helped her think, helped her see connections that might otherwise have remained hidden. On the 5th day after the abandoned taxi discovery, the driver made his next move. The call came at 6 in the morning when Sarah was reviewing traffic camera footage for the 100th time. Another taxi had been found, this time in a residential neighborhood in Decatur. Same scenario, engine running, doors open, no driver, but this time there was no victim in the trunk. Instead, there was a note. Sarah arrived at the scene within 20 minutes, Max riding in the back seat with his head thrust out the partially open window, tasting the morning air for any scent that might be relevant. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where families lived and children played, and nothing bad was supposed to happen. Police vehicles lined the street, their presence drawing curious looks from residents who were just beginning their morning routines. The taxi sat in front of a modest single-family home, its yellow paint vivid against the green lawns and white siding of the surrounding houses. Sarah approached slowly, noting the positions of the officers who had secured the scene, evaluating the angles and sightlines with the paranoid eye she had developed over the past week. The note was on the driver's seat, a single sheet of white paper folded once. Sarah pulled on latex gloves before touching it, though she suspected the gesture was futile. The driver would not have left fingerprints. He was too smart for that. She unfolded the paper and read the words that had been typed in a plain, unremarkable font. "You are looking in the wrong places, Lieutenant Collins. The answer is not in the taxis. The answer is in what the taxis represent. Freedom of movement, the ability to go anywhere, anytime, without leaving a trace. I have been moving through this city for years, watching, learning, preparing. And now the time has come to show you what I have built. Find the depot before midnight, or another driver will disappear." The clock is ticking. Sarah read the note twice, 3 times, committing every word to memory. A depot. The driver was telling her where to look, giving her a clue that could lead to his location. But why? Why would someone who had spent months planning every detail suddenly give away information that could lead to his capture? Because it is another game, she realized. He wants me to find the depot. He wants me to see what he has built. Whatever is there, it is part of his plan, another piece of the puzzle he has constructed. She turned to the officers who had gathered around her. "I need every taxi depot in the city," she commanded. "Company-owned facilities, independent lots, anywhere that cabs are stored or maintained. Get me a list within the hour." The list, when it arrived, contained 14 locations spread across the metropolitan area. Sarah divided the task force into teams and sent them to investigate. But even as she gave the orders, she knew that none of those locations would be right. The driver had said the answer was in what the taxis represented: freedom of movement, the ability to go anywhere without leaving a trace. He was not talking about a corporate facility with security cameras and employee records. He was talking about somewhere off the grid, somewhere hidden, somewhere that only he knew about. She retreated to the conference room and stared at the map of Atlanta, trying to think like the driver, trying to see the city through his eyes. He had been operating for at least 6 months, probably longer. He had abducted at least 4 drivers without leaving any evidence. He had conducted extensive surveillance on Sarah herself, tracking her movements and photographing her activities. To do all of that, he needed a base of operations, somewhere secure and private, somewhere he could hold victims and store equipment without fear of discovery. Her eyes traced the arc of taxi abandonment locations, following the curve from west to east across the northern half of the city. And then, almost unconsciously, her gaze drifted south to the industrial areas that bordered the airport, the warehouses and storage facilities and abandoned buildings that dotted that part of the landscape. If she were looking for a place to hide, a place where unusual activity would go unnoticed, that was where she would start. She began pulling up records for that area, searching for properties that might fit the profile. Most were legitimate businesses, warehouses serving the nearby airport, distribution centers for online retailers, cold storage facilities for restaurant suppliers. But scattered among them were abandoned structures, buildings that had been vacated during the economic downturns of the past decade and never reoccupied. One listing caught her attention: a former vehicle impound lot that had been closed 5 years ago after the company that operated it went bankrupt. The property had been tied up in legal disputes ever since, ownership unclear, maintenance non-existent. Satellite imagery showed a large fenced compound with several buildings, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by other industrial properties that would provide noise and visual cover. Sarah printed the address and grabbed her jacket. Max was already on his feet, having recognized the signs that indicated they were about to move out. She did not wait for backup, did not notify the task force, did not do any of the things that protocol demanded. The driver had given her until midnight, but she knew that deadline was arbitrary, a pressure tactic designed to force her into hasty decisions. If she went in with a full team, with sirens and searchlights and the full weight of the Atlanta Police Department, the driver would see them coming and disappear. He had proven himself capable of vanishing without a trace. She would not give him that opportunity. The drive to the abandoned impound lot took 40 minutes through midday traffic. Sarah used the time to center herself, to calm the adrenaline that was making her heart race and her hands tremble. She had been in dangerous situations before, had faced armed suspects and violent criminals, and situations where her life hung in the balance. But this was different. This was personal in a way that nothing had been before, and she could not afford to let that personal stake compromise her judgment. The property looked even more desolate in person than it had in the satellite images. The fence that surrounded it was rusted and sagging, its gate secured with a chain and padlock that had long since oxidized into uselessness. Beyond the fence, she could see the outlines of several buildings, their windows dark and their walls stained with years of neglect. Weeds had pushed through cracks in the asphalt, reclaiming the space for nature. Everything about the place screamed abandonment, decay, the slow surrender of human construction to the forces of entropy. But Sarah noticed something that the satellite images had not shown. Tire tracks, fresh ones, cutting through the overgrown grass that had encroached on the main driveway. Someone had been here recently, and they had been driving a vehicle heavy enough to leave deep impressions in the soft earth. She parked her cruiser a block away, in the lot of a functioning warehouse where it would not attract attention. Then she approached the impound lot on foot, Max moving silently at her side, both of them in full operational mode. She did not draw her weapon yet, did not want to limit her options, but her hand rested on the grip, ready to react in an instant. The gate yielded easily to her push, the chain falling away with a dull clatter. She slipped through the gap and paused, listening. The sounds of the industrial district provided a constant backdrop, the rumble of trucks, the whine of machinery, the distant roar of aircraft taking off from the nearby airport. Against that background, the impound lot was silent, almost preternaturally still. Max led the way, his nose working constantly, his body low and alert. He moved toward the largest of the buildings, a warehouse-style structure with loading bays along one side and a human-sized door at the corner. Sarah followed, watching their flanks, scanning for any sign of movement or threat. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open slowly, wincing at the groan of hinges that had not been oiled in years. Beyond was darkness, the interior of the building lit only by the slivers of sunlight that penetrated gaps in the walls and roof. Sarah pulled out her flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the space. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The building was filled with vehicles, not just taxis, though there were several of those, but all types, sedans, vans, SUVs, trucks. They were arranged in neat rows, like cars in a dealership lot, each one cleaned and maintained despite the decay of the building that housed them. Sarah counted at least 30 vehicles before she stopped, overwhelmed by the implications of what she was seeing. This was the driver's collection, his fleet. The taxis were just the beginning, the visible tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper than anyone had imagined. She moved through the rows, Max at her side, both of them alert for any sign that they were not alone. The vehicles were empty, their doors unlocked, their interiors pristine. Sarah checked a few at random and found registration documents in the glove compartments, each one bearing a different name and address. Stolen identities, she realized. The driver had been building a network of untraceable vehicles, each one registered under a false name, each one capable of moving through the city without leaving a record. At the far end of the building, she found a door that led to an attached structure, a smaller building that might once have served as an office. She pushed it open and stepped inside. her flashlight revealing a space that made the vehicle collection seem mundane by comparison. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged in overlapping layers that created a collage of surveillance documentation. And every single photograph was of her. Sarah walking to her car, Sarah entering the precinct, Sarah at a coffee shop, at a gas station, at the grocery store. Sarah with Max training in the park, running through an obstacle course, sitting on a bench while she ate lunch. Her entire life, captured in images, arranged like some kind of shrine. In the center of the room was a desk, and on the desk was a computer, its screen glowing with a soft blue light. Sarah approached cautiously, half expecting some kind of trap. But the desk was just a desk, the computer just a computer. She touched the mouse, and the screen came to life, displaying a single window with a single message. "Hello, Lieutenant Collins. I knew you would come. I have been waiting for this moment for so long. Now you see what I see. Now you understand what you mean to me. The game is almost over, but there is one more move to make. Go to the tunnel. Go to where the city hides its secrets. I will be waiting." Below the message was an address, a location in the industrial district not far from where she stood. Sarah memorized it instantly, her mind already racing ahead to what she would find there. She should call for backup, she knew that. Every ounce of training and experience told her to wait, to gather resources, to approach this final confrontation with overwhelming force. But she also knew that the driver had anticipated that response, had planned for it, had probably prepared contingencies that would allow him to escape if she followed protocol. No. This ended tonight. This ended with her, face to face with the man who had turned her into an obsession. She looked down at Max, who was watching her with those amber eyes that always seemed to understand more than any dog should. "Ready?" she asked. Max's response was to rise to his feet, his body coiled and ready, his attention fixed on the door that led back to the outside world. Together they left the building, left the fleet of stolen vehicles and the shrine of photographs, left the evidence of one man's obsession and headed toward the final confrontation. The address led to a drainage tunnel, one of the massive concrete pipes that channeled stormwater away from the city streets. The entrance was hidden behind a tangle of overgrown bushes, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Sarah pushed through the vegetation and found herself facing a dark opening, perhaps 10 feet in diameter, that descended at a shallow angle into the earth. Max hesitated at the entrance, his hackles rising, a low growl building in his throat. Sarah understood his reluctance. The tunnel was a perfect ambush site, a confined space with no room to maneuver, no cover to exploit, no escape route if things went wrong. Every instinct she possessed screamed that walking into that darkness was a mistake, but the driver was in there. She could feel it, a certainty that went beyond logic or evidence. He was waiting for her, just as his message had promised, waiting to finish whatever this was between them. She drew her weapon and clicked on the tactical light mounted beneath the barrel. The beam pierced the darkness, revealing smooth concrete walls and a floor that was damp but not flooded. She took a breath, steadied her nerves, and stepped into the tunnel. The sounds of the outside world faded quickly, replaced by the echo of her footsteps and the soft pad of Max's paws on the concrete. Water dripped somewhere ahead, a rhythmic plink that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. The smell was earthy and damp, the scent of a place that rarely saw sunlight. She walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the tunnel curving gently to the left, descending deeper into the infrastructure that lay beneath the city. And then, without warning, the tunnel opened into a larger space, a junction where several pipes converged, and there, in the center of that junction, stood a man. He was exactly as Esperanza Delgado had described her husband's strange fare. Average height, average build, average clothes. There was nothing remarkable about his appearance, nothing that would make him stand out in a crowd. He could have been anyone, everyone, no one at all. But his eyes. His eyes were wrong. They gleamed in the beam of her flashlight with an intensity that bordered on madness, fixed on her with a focus that made her skin crawl. "Lieutenant Collins," he said, and his voice was that hoarse whisper that Ronald Meeks had described, a sound that seemed designed to be forgettable, untraceable. "You found me. I knew you would. I have been watching you for so long, learning everything about you, and I knew that you would not be able to resist." Sarah kept her weapon trained on his center mass, her finger resting on the trigger guard, ready to fire at the slightest provocation. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Why are you doing this?" The man smiled, and somehow that smile was more disturbing than anything else about him. "You do not remember me. Of course you do not. I was nobody to you, just another face in the crowd, another criminal you processed and forgot. But I remember you, Lieutenant. I remember every detail of that day, every word you spoke, every look you gave me. You destroyed my life with a casual indifference that still takes my breath away. What day? What are you talking about?" The man took a step closer, and Max's growl intensified. 8 years ago," the man said. "A routine traffic stop that turned into an arrest. I was carrying a small amount of marijuana, just enough for personal use, nothing that should have mattered. But you found it, and you arrested me, and because of that arrest I lost my job, my apartment, my girlfriend, everything that made my life worth living. All because you decided to search my car on a random Tuesday afternoon." Sarah searched her memory, trying to place the face, but nothing came. She had made hundreds of arrests over the years, thousands of traffic stops. This man could have been any of them. "I was nobody before that day," the man continued, his voice rising with emotion. "But after, I had nothing left to lose. So I decided to become somebody. I decided to become the one thing that you could not ignore, could not dismiss, could not forget. I became the driver, and I spent years building my skills, my resources, my network. I learned how to move through this city without being seen, how to take people without leaving evidence, how to plan operations that would make the best detectives in the department look like fools. And all of it, every single bit of it, was for you, to show you what you created when you destroyed my life." "The missing drivers," Sarah said. "Where are they?" The man's smile widened. "Gone," he said simply. "They served their purpose, and now they are gone. Just like all the others who crossed my path over the years. You have no idea how many, Lieutenant. You have no idea what I have been doing while you went about your life, oblivious to the monster you created." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air of the tunnel. This man was confessing to multiple murders, casually, proudly, as if they were accomplishments to be celebrated rather than crimes to be punished. "It ends here," she said, her voice steady despite the horror that was churning in her gut. "You are under arrest. Get on your knees and put your hands behind your head." The man laughed, a sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "No, Lieutenant, it does not end here. This is just the beginning. You see, I've spent so long preparing for this moment, planning every detail, and I am not about to let it end with something as mundane as an arrest. I want you to understand, truly understand, what you did to me. And the only way for that to happen is for you to experience loss the way I experienced it. Total, absolute, irreversible." He moved with a speed that caught her off guard, lunging not toward her, but toward Max. Sarah fired, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space, but the man had already closed the distance, a knife appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. Max reacted with the training and instinct that made him legendary in the K-9 unit. He met the driver's charge with one of his own, leaping toward the man's weapon arm with jaws that could exert hundreds of pounds of pressure per square inch. The knife sliced through the air, missing Max by inches, And then Max's teeth found their target, clamping down on the driver's forearm with a crunch of bone and a spray of blood. The driver screamed, a sound of pain and rage that seemed to come from somewhere primal. He tried to shake Max off, tried to bring the knife around for another strike, but Max held on with the determination that had defined his entire career. Sarah closed the distance, her weapon trained on the driver's head, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Drop the knife," she commanded. "Do it now or I will shoot." The driver looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something shift. The madness was still there, but beneath it was something else, something that looked almost like satisfaction. "You think you have won," he gasped through teeth clenched against the pain. "You think this is over. But I want you to remember this moment, Lieutenant. Remember how close I came. Remember that I could have taken everything from you, just like you took everything from me." He dropped the knife. It clattered on the concrete floor, the sound echoing through the tunnel junction. Sarah moved in quickly, kicking the knife away and forcing the driver to the ground. Max released his grip and stepped back, blood staining his muzzle, his eyes still fixed on the man who had threatened his partner. Sarah secured the driver's wrists with her handcuffs, ignoring his screams of pain as the metal bit into his injured arm. "It is over," she said, more to herself than to him. "It is over." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. The driver had been right about one thing. This moment would stay with her forever. The knowledge of what he had done, the lives he had taken, the obsession he had cultivated. All of it traced back to a traffic stop she could not even remember. A decision made on a random Tuesday afternoon that had set in motion a chain of events ending here, in a drainage tunnel beneath the streets of Atlanta. She called for backup and waited in the darkness, Max at her side, the driver secured on the ground. The sounds of the city filtered down through the tunnel entrance, distant and muffled, a reminder that life continued above even while horror unfolded below. Sarah breathed in the damp air and tried to process what had happened, but her mind felt numb, overloaded by the events of the past week. The backup arrived within minutes, filling the tunnel with flashlights and voices and the organized chaos of a crime scene response. Paramedics attended to the driver's arm, while officers took custody and began the process of documenting the scene. Sarah gave a preliminary statement, her voice flat and mechanical, the words coming automatically while her thoughts remained elsewhere. Captain Morrison appeared at some point, his face drawn with concern. "Collins," he said, putting a hand on her shoulder, "you should not have come here alone. You could have been killed." "I know," she replied, "but it had to be this way. He would not have shown himself to anyone else. It was always going to come down to this, just him and me." Morrison looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We got him," he said. "Whatever else happens, we got him. The task force is already executing warrants on the depot you found. They are recovering evidence, documenting the vehicles, building the case. This guy is going away forever." Sarah nodded, but she could not feel the satisfaction that should have accompanied those words. The driver had been caught, yes, but the damage he had caused, the lives he had destroyed, could never be undone. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a question lingered that she could not shake. How many others were out there, people she had affected without knowing it, carrying grudges that might someday explode into violence? She pushed the thought away and focused on the present. There would be time for reflection later, time to process and analyze and draw whatever lessons could be drawn. Right now, there was work to do. The investigation that followed the driver's arrest consumed the next several weeks. His real name was Thomas Garrett, and he had indeed been arrested by Sarah 8 years ago, exactly as he had described. The charge had been possession of a controlled substance, a misdemeanor that had resulted in probation and community service. But the consequences had been exactly what Garrett claimed. Job loss, eviction, the collapse of his personal relationships. Somewhere in that downward spiral, something had broken inside him, and the driver had been born. The depot yielded more evidence than anyone had expected. Garrett had kept meticulous records of his activities, documenting every surveillance session, every victim selection, every step of his operations. The records revealed that the 4 missing taxi drivers were only a fraction of his total victims. Over the course of 5 years, he had abducted and killed at least 12 people, their bodies disposed of in locations that were still being investigated. The photographs in his shrine numbered in the thousands, representing months of obsessive surveillance of Sarah's life. Analysts who reviewed them discovered that Garrett had been watching her since before his arrest, fascinated by her even then. The arrest had not created his obsession. It had merely focused it, transforming diffuse fascination into targeted rage. Sarah testified at Garrett's trial, recounting the events of the investigation and the confrontation in the tunnel. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge imposed multiple consecutive life sentences, ensuring that Garrett would never again walk free. But even with the trial concluded and justice served, Sarah found herself changed by the experience. She had always known, intellectually, that her work had consequences beyond the immediate cases she handled. Every arrest, every prosecution, every conviction rippled outward in ways that were impossible to predict. But Garrett had forced her to confront that reality in a way she could not ignore. A random traffic stop, a routine search, a standard arrest. And from that seed had grown a monster who had destroyed more than a dozen lives. She did not regret the arrest. She could not regret enforcing the law, doing the job she had sworn to do. But she carried the knowledge of Garrett with her now, a constant reminder that even the smallest actions could have enormous consequences. It made her more careful, more thoughtful, more aware of the human beings behind the badge numbers and case files. Max seemed to sense the change in her, responding with an increased attentiveness that went beyond his normal vigilance. He stayed closer to her during their shifts, watched her more intently during their downtime, offered comfort in his own wordless way when she sat alone with her thoughts. Their bond, already strong, deepened into something that Sarah could only describe as understanding. He knew what she had been through, knew the weight she carried, and he shared it with her in the way that only a partner could. Months passed. The media attention faded. The task force disbanded. Life returned to something approaching normal, with new cases replacing old ones and the relentless pace of police work leaving little time for extended reflection. Sarah threw herself into her duties with renewed dedication, finding in the work a purpose that helped keep the darker thoughts at bay. But late at night, when the city quieted and the only sound was Max's steady breathing beside her bed, Sarah sometimes thought about the tunnel, not about Garrett, not about the confrontation or the violence that had ended it, but about the moment just before. The moment when she had descended into the darkness, not knowing what awaited her, not knowing if she would emerge alive. She had made a choice in that moment, a choice to face her demons alone rather than wait for the safety of numbers. And that choice, more than anything else, defined who she was. She was Lieutenant Sarah Collins of the Atlanta Police Department, a woman who walked into darkness because that was where the monsters lived. And beside her always was Max, friend, partner, guardian. Together they would continue to do the work that needed to be done, protecting a city that never slept from threats that never stopped. It was not a life that most people would choose, but it was hers, and she would not have it any other way. The night after the trial ended, Sarah took Max to the park where they often trained, a stretch of green space that offered some respite from the concrete and steel of the city. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the grass and creating shadows that danced in the gentle breeze. She let Max off his leash and watched him run, his powerful body moving with a grace that always amazed her. She thought about Garrett's words in the tunnel, his claim that she had created him. There was a twisted logic to it, she supposed. If she had not made that arrest, if she had chosen to overlook the marijuana or give him a warning instead, his life might have taken a different path. But that logic led nowhere good. The same argument could be used to excuse any crime, to shift blame from the perpetrator to anyone who had ever wronged them. Garrett had made his own choices, and those choices had led him to become a murderer. Her role in his origin story did not absolve him of responsibility for what he had done, but it did remind her of something important. Every interaction mattered. Every decision had consequences. The people she encountered in her work were not just case numbers or statistics. They were human beings with lives and histories and futures that could be shaped by a single moment. She could not control what they did with those moments, but she could be mindful of the power she wielded and the responsibility that came with it. Max returned to her side, panting happily, his tongue lolling out in a K-9 grin. She knelt down and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Max leaned into her embrace, and for a moment the world contracted to just the two of them, standing in the moonlight on a patch of grass in the middle of a city of millions. It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it was enough. It was everything. They walked home through the quiet streets, passing beneath lamplights that created pools of gold in the darkness. The city was at peace, or as close to peace as Atlanta ever got. Somewhere, criminals were plotting their next moves, victims were suffering in silence, and officers were responding to calls that would test their courage and their commitment. The work never ended. The darkness never fully retreated, but that was why people like Sarah existed, to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them, to walk into the shadows so that others did not have to. Her apartment was a modest space, functional rather than comfortable, decorated with the minimal touches of someone who spent most of her time elsewhere. But it was home. The place where she could set aside her badge and her weapon and be something other than Lieutenant Collins for a few hours. She changed into comfortable clothes, poured a glass of water and settled onto the couch with Max stretched out beside her. The television offered its usual parade of late-night programming, but she could not focus on any of it. Her mind kept returning to the case, to Garrett, to the web of obsession and violence that had consumed him for so many years. She wondered what had happened in his past, before that fateful traffic stop, to create the conditions for such an extreme reaction. The record showed no history of violence, no criminal behavior beyond minor offenses, no indication that he was capable of the atrocities he eventually committed. He had been, by all appearances, a normal person living a normal life, until he was not. That was the most disturbing part, Sarah realized. The ease with which a seemingly ordinary person could transform into a monster. She wanted to believe that there were warning signs, that people like Garrett were identifiable before they committed their crimes, that the system could catch them before they caused harm. But the evidence did not support that belief. Garrett had slipped through every filter, every checkpoint, every safeguard that society had erected. He had hidden his darkness behind a mask of normalcy, so complete that even those closest to him had suspected nothing. It was a sobering thought, and it stayed with her as she drifted off to sleep, Max's warm body pressed against her legs, and his steady breathing providing a rhythm that lulled her into unconsciousness. She dreamed of tunnels, endless tunnels stretching beneath the city, branching and converging, leading to destinations she could not see. She walked through them alone, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, searching for something she could not name. Max was not with her in the dream, and his absence felt like an amputation, a fundamental wrongness that colored everything she saw. The tunnel walls were covered with photographs, just like in Garrett's shrine, but in the dream, the photographs were of everyone she had ever arrested, ever confronted, ever affected in any way. Their faces watched her as she passed, their eyes following her with expressions that ranged from hatred to sorrow to something that might have been understanding. At the end of the tunnel was a mirror, and in the mirror she saw herself, but older, worn, her green eyes dimmed by years of accumulated weight. The reflection spoke without moving its lips. This is what the work costs. This is what it takes. Is it worth it? She woke before she could answer, the morning sun streaming through her window and Max nosing at her hand impatiently. The dream faded quickly, as dreams do, but its question lingered. Was it worth it? The sacrifice, the toll, the endless confrontation with human darkness. She looked at Max, who had given up on subtlety and was now actively pushing his food bowl around the kitchen floor. Despite everything, she smiled. Yes, she said to herself, yes, it is worth it. She fed Max, brewed coffee, and prepared for another day. There were cases to work, reports to file, officers to supervise. The machinery of justice required constant tending, and she was one of the mechanics who kept it running. It was not glamorous work, and it was rarely appreciated, but it was necessary. Someone had to do it, and she had chosen to be that someone. Her phone buzzed with a message from Detective Martinez. New case, possible connection to an open investigation. Need your eyes on scene. Sarah finished her coffee and gathered her gear, Max already waiting by the door with an expression of eager anticipation. Looks like we are back to work, she told him. Ready? Max's response was the same as always. A bright-eyed alertness that said he was ready for anything. They left the apartment together, stepping out into a city that was already awake and moving. Millions of people going about their lives in blissful ignorance of the dangers that surrounded them. Sarah and Max would work to keep it that way, to maintain the thin barrier between order and chaos that allowed civilization to function. It was a job that never ended, a battle that could never be fully won, but it was their job, their battle, and they would fight it with everything they had. The new case turned out to be a homicide, a woman found dead in her apartment in Midtown under circumstances that suggested professional involvement. The victim was a lawyer who had been working on a case involving organized crime, and the suspicion was that her death was connected to her professional activities. Sarah spent the morning at the crime scene, directing the forensic team and interviewing witnesses, while Max worked the perimeter for any scent evidence that might prove useful. It was the kind of case that would dominate her attention for weeks, maybe months. The kind of case that would test her skills and her resolve, that would push her to her limits and force her to confront aspects of human nature that most people preferred to ignore. But it was also the kind of case that reminded her why she had chosen this life, why she continued to do this work despite its costs. Somewhere, justice was waiting to be served, and she was one of the few people capable of serving it. As the day wore on and the investigation progressed, Sarah found herself settling into the familiar rhythms of detective work. The disquiet that had lingered since the Garrett case began to fade, replaced by the focused engagement that came with having a clear purpose and a defined mission. She was doing what she was meant to do, and for now, that was enough. Max walked beside her as they returned to their cruiser at the end of the day, his presence as constant and reassuring as it had always been. The sun was setting over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, transforming the city into something almost beautiful. Sarah paused for a moment to take it in, to appreciate the view that she too often ignored in the rush of her daily responsibilities. "Not bad," she murmured, more to herself than to Max. "Not bad at all." Max looked up at her, and for a moment it seemed like he understood exactly what she meant. Then he yawned, breaking the spell, and Sarah laughed despite herself. "Fine," she said. "Let us go home." They drove through the evening traffic, the city transitioning from the bustle of the workday to the energy of the nightlife that would carry it through until dawn. Somewhere out there, crimes were being committed and victims were suffering. But for tonight at least, those were problems for someone else. Sarah had done her part, had given everything she had to give, and now it was time to rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight she would sleep and Max would keep watch, and together they would be ready for whatever came next. That was the nature of the work. It never truly ended, never allowed for complete rest or permanent victory. But within that endless struggle, there were moments of triumph, moments of connection, moments when the darkness receded just enough to let the light shine through. Sarah had learned to treasure those moments, to let them sustain her through the harder times that inevitably followed. She pulled into her parking space and killed the engine, sitting for a moment in the quiet of the car. Max waited patiently beside her, understanding that she needed this brief interlude before facing the night. "Thank you," she said again, reaching over to scratch behind his ears, "for being here, for being you." Max leaned into her touch, his eyes closing in contentment. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they had shared, everything they had survived, everything they would face together in the days and years to come. They went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the city continued its eternal dance of light and shadow, order and chaos, hope and despair. Lieutenant Sarah Collins and her K-9 partner Max were part of that dance, had been part of it for years, and would continue to be part of it for years to come. It was not always a pretty dance, not always a joyful one, but it was theirs, and they would see it through to whatever end awaited them. Because that was what they did. That was who they were. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The weeks following the new homicide case blurred together in a haze of interviews, evidence analysis, and late nights at the precinct. The victim, Amanda Chen, had been working on a case involving a network of shell companies that were laundering money for various criminal enterprises. Her death had sent shockwaves through the legal community, and the pressure to solve it came from every direction. The media, the mayor's office, the FBI, and Amanda's grieving family. Sarah threw herself into the investigation with the same intensity she had brought to the Garrett case, but this time she was more careful about pacing herself, more mindful of the toll that obsessive focus could take. She delegated more to her team, took breaks when she needed them, and made sure to spend time with Max outside of work, maintaining the balance that kept both of them healthy and effective. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after the initial crime scene processing, when a financial analyst on loan from the FBI managed to trace one of the shell companies back to a holding corporation owned by a man named Victor Markov. Markov was a known figure in organized crime circles, suspected of involvement in everything from drug trafficking to human smuggling, but he had never been charged with anything because witnesses had a habit of disappearing before they could testify. Sarah knew that going after Markov would be dangerous. He had resources, connections, and a ruthlessness that made Garrett look like an amateur. But she also knew that Amanda Chen deserved justice, that her death could not be allowed to go unpunished, that the message sent by her murder could not be allowed to stand. The operation to arrest Markov took months to plan. Sarah worked with federal prosecutors to build an airtight case, one that would not depend on any single witness or piece of evidence. She coordinated with other law enforcement agencies, sharing information and resources in a way that crossed jurisdictional boundaries and bureaucratic obstacles. And when everything was finally in place, she led the team that executed the arrest warrant, Max at her side, as they approached the luxury high-rise where Markov maintained his primary residence. The arrest went smoothly, almost anticlimactically. Markov was found in his penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that his criminal empire had provided, and he surrendered without resistance. He knew, Sarah suspected, that fighting would only make things worse, that his lawyers would have a better chance of getting him off if he played the role of the wrongly accused businessman rather than the violent criminal. But the evidence was too strong, the case too solid. The trial lasted 3 months, and at the end of it, Markov was convicted on multiple counts including murder for hire, money laundering, and racketeering. The sentence was life without parole, and as Sarah watched him being led away in handcuffs, she felt a satisfaction that had eluded her in the immediate aftermath of Garrett's arrest. This was why she did the work. This was what made the sacrifices worthwhile. Not the personal victories or the individual confrontations, but the larger impact. The criminals removed from society, the victims given justice, the message sent that even the most powerful were not above the law. She celebrated with her team that night, a rare indulgence that she usually avoided. They gathered at a bar near the precinct, swapping war stories and decompressing from the months of stress that the case had imposed. Martinez told jokes that were not as funny as he thought they were. Chen from forensics got drunk and started philosophizing about the nature of justice. Morrison stopped by briefly to congratulate everyone before heading home to his family. And through it all, Max waited patiently in the car, understanding that this was a human ritual that did not include him, but that his presence nearby was still needed. When Sarah finally emerged, pleasantly buzzed and more relaxed than she had been in months, she opened the rear door and let him out for a quick walk before the drive home. "Good boy," she said, watching him explore the small patch of grass beside the parking lot. "You are such a good boy." Max looked up at her, tail wagging, and she felt again that surge of gratitude that never seemed to diminish no matter how many times she experienced it. He had been with her through so much, had seen her at her worst and her best, had never wavered in his loyalty or his support. She could not imagine doing this work without him. They drove home through the quiet streets, the city at peace under the blanket of night. Sarah's apartment welcomed her with its familiar shapes and shadows, and she moved through her evening routine on autopilot, her mind still processing the events of the day. She fell asleep quickly. Max curled up on his bed in the corner of the room, and her dreams were peaceful for the first time in longer than she could remember. No tunnels, no photographs, no questions she could not answer. Just the quiet contentment of a job well done and the promise of more work to come. The years that followed brought more cases, more challenges, more opportunities to serve the cause of justice. Sarah rose through the ranks, eventually becoming Captain Collins, a position that required her to spend more time behind a desk and less time in the field. She missed the action, missed the immediacy of detective work, but she found satisfaction in leading her officers, in shaping the department's approach to the endless complexities of urban crime. Max aged gracefully, his muzzle graying and his movements slowing, but his spirit remained as sharp as ever. When he finally reached the point where active duty was no longer possible, Sarah retired him with full honors, a ceremony that drew officers from across the department who had known and worked with the legendary K-9. He spent his final years living with Sarah as a civilian, accompanying her to the precinct for occasional visits, but mostly enjoying the quiet pleasures of a well-earned retirement. When Max passed away at the age of 14, Sarah grieved in a way she had not grieved since the death of her father years before. He had been more than a partner, more than a pet, more than a friend. He had been a part of her in a way that defied easy categorization, and his absence left a hole that would never fully heal. But life continued, as it always did. The work continued. The city continued its eternal struggle between light and darkness, and Sarah continued to do her part in that struggle. She never took another K-9 partner, feeling that to do so would somehow diminish what she had shared with Max. Instead, she focused her energy on training and mentoring the next generation of K-9 handlers, passing on the lessons she had learned through years of experience. She thought often about the cases that had defined her career: Garrett, Markov, dozens of others whose names had faded but whose faces she still remembered. Each one had taught her something, had shaped her in some way, had contributed to the officer and the person she had become. The work had taken its toll, leaving scars both visible and hidden, but it had also given her a purpose that sustained her through every hardship. On her last day as captain, Sarah stood in her office and looked out at the city she had served for more than 30 years. The skyline had changed since she first joined the force. New buildings rising where old ones had stood, the constant flux of urban evolution. But the essence of the place remained the same. A city of millions, each one with their own story, their own struggles, their own capacity for good and evil. She had done her best to tip the balance toward good. Whether she had succeeded was not for her to judge. That was a question for history, for the people who would come after her and assess the impact of her work. All she could do was know in her heart that she had given everything she had, that she had faced the darkness without flinching, that she had tried to make a difference in a world that often seemed indifferent to individual effort. Max had understood that. In his own wordless way, he had shared that understanding, had supported it, had embodied it through every day of their partnership. And though he was gone now, his legacy lived on in the work she had done, the officers she had trained, the justice she had served. She picked up the photograph that sat on her desk, the one she had kept since the night of the abandoned taxi. It showed her and Max walking across a parking lot, captured without her knowledge by a man who had turned obsession into murder. She had kept it as a reminder of how quickly things could change, of how even the most ordinary moments could contain hidden significance, of the importance of remaining vigilant in a world where darkness was always waiting to emerge. But now, looking at the photograph with the eyes of someone nearing the end of her career, she saw something else. She saw herself and her partner, walking together into whatever awaited them, unafraid because they faced it as a team. She saw the bond that had sustained her through the hardest moments of her life. She saw the meaning that lay beneath the surface of every image, every moment, every choice. That was the lesson the driver had never understood. He had seen the photographs as evidence of his control, proof that he could observe without being observed, manipulate without being detected. But the photographs did not capture what mattered. They showed surface details, external appearances, but they missed the connection that linked one soul to another, the invisible threads that bound partners and friends and families together. Sarah put the photograph in her pocket and walked out of her office for the last time. The officers in the bullpen rose to their feet, offering a round of applause that she accepted with a nod and a smile. She shook hands, exchanged embraces, promised to keep in touch. And then she walked out of the precinct and into the afternoon sunlight, a civilian for the first time in more than 3 decades. The world looked different from this side, she realized, softer somehow, less urgent. She had spent so long seeing everything through the lens of threat assessment and criminal potential that she had forgotten what it was like to simply exist, to move through the world without constantly analyzing its dangers. She got into her car and drove without a destination in mind, letting the streets guide her where they would. Eventually she found herself at the park where she and Max had spent so many hours training and playing, the patch of green that had been their refuge from the demands of the job. She parked and walked to the bench where she had often sat watching him run, feeling the sun on her face and the breeze in her hair. The park was busy with families and joggers and young people enjoying the weather, none of them aware that the grey-haired woman on the bench had spent her life protecting them from things they would never know about. And that was fine. That was as it should be. The work was not done for recognition or gratitude. It was done because it needed to be done. Because someone had to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. Because the alternative was unthinkable. Sarah sat on the bench for a long time, watching the world go by, thinking about the past and the future and the strange journey that had connected them. She thought about Max, about Garrett, about Markov, about all the cases and criminals and victims who had populated her career. She thought about the officers she had trained, the lives she had touched, the small differences she had made in a world that often seemed immune to individual impact. And gradually, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon and the shadows lengthened across the grass, she felt a peace settle over her that she had not experienced in years. The work was done, her chapter finished. What came next was unknown, but for the first time in her life, that uncertainty felt like freedom rather than threat. She stood up from the bench and stretched, feeling the ache in her joints that came with age and years of physical strain. Then she walked back to her car, got in, and drove home. The apartment was quiet when she arrived, quiet in a way that still felt wrong even after all these months. She missed Max's greeting, the click of his nails on the floor, the warm pressure of his body against her leg. She would always miss those things, but she had memories and photographs and the knowledge that they had lived well together, had done good work together, had made a difference in the way that mattered most. That would have to be enough. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the city transition from day to night. The lights came on one by one, creating a constellation of human activity that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere out there, crimes were being committed and officers were responding, the eternal dance continuing as it always had and always would. Sarah raised her glass in a silent toast to all of them, to the officers who served, to the victims who suffered, to the criminals who would eventually face justice, and to Max, wherever he was, watching over her still in whatever way the universe allowed. To the work, she said quietly, and to those who do it. She drank, and the wine was good, and the night was peaceful, and for now that was everything she needed. The city lights flickered and pulsed, a living tapestry of stories unfolding beneath the stars. Captain Sarah Collins, retired, watched them with the eyes of someone who had seen too much and yet somehow still believed in the possibility of redemption. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. New beginnings, old endings, the continuation of a story that had no final chapter. But tonight she would rest. Tonight she would remember. Tonight she would honor everything she had been and everything she had done, and she would find peace in the knowledge that she had given her best to a world that desperately needed it. The darkness outside was vast, but within her apartment there was light, and in the end that was all anyone could ask for. A small circle of illumination against the endless night, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope could survive. Sarah finished her wine and went to bed, and her sleep was dreamless and deep, and when she woke the next morning the sun was shining and the world was waiting and life, as it always did, continued. She had been a K-9 handler, a detective, a lieutenant, a captain. She had faced monsters and emerged scarred but unbroken. She had loved and lost and carried on regardless. And through it all, she had never forgotten the lesson that Max had taught her from the very first day of their partnership. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That loyalty meant standing by those who counted on you even when the odds seemed impossible. That the bond between partners could transcend species and circumstance and even death itself. She carried that lesson with her now into this new chapter of her life. It would guide her through whatever challenges awaited, just as it had guided her through the challenges she had already faced. That was the legacy Max had left her, and it was worth more than any commendation or award or public recognition. Lieutenant Sarah Collins had walked into the darkness and emerged into the light. The journey had been long and hard and filled with moments of doubt and despair, but in the end she had prevailed, not because she was stronger or smarter than her enemies, but because she had something they lacked, a partner who never gave up, a bond that never broke, a faith that justice would ultimately triumph. The abandoned taxi on Auburn Avenue seemed like a lifetime ago. The photograph clutched in Ronald Meeks's trembling hands, a relic of a past that had been transformed by everything that followed. The driver was serving multiple life sentences, his obsession contained within prison walls where it could harm no one else. And Sarah was free, finally free, to live whatever remained of her life on her own terms. She smiled as she looked out at the morning city, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the promise of possibility in the air. Max would have approved, she thought. He had always been more interested in the present moment than in dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. Okay, she said to herself, to the city, to the memory of her partner. Let us see what comes next. And with that, she stepped forward into the new day, leaving shadows behind. The story was not over, but this chapter had reached its natural conclusion. Sarah Collins had found her light at last, and somewhere out there, Max knew